I want to thank you all for coming. My name is Bryan Palmer. I'm going to host the event tonight. We're really here to launch a book edited by Cy Gonick, which is for sale in the back at a deep discount of $25. Canada, since 1960, A People's History. It's published by Lorimer. As most of you will know, it's a collection of essays that look at the experience from the 1960s on as covered in Canadian Dimension. Cy wanted me to tell everybody that he doesn't like the title, but Lorimer insisted on it because he thought it would sell more books. So it's the usual case of false advertising, but we won't get too angry about it. I have a contribution in it on socialism and how socialism has developed being developed in the pages of the journal, and the way the journal and the magazine has really handled the question of socialism. But we have a number of speakers tonight, and I've asked these speakers some of whom have essays in the book and some of whom don't, and I've asked them to speak both, if they want, about the magazine, its place and its meaning, and their own, perhaps, contributions to the book itself. I'll say a few words about Dimension. I've been writing for the magazine since 1983, which is something I'm very proud about. I've covered labor conventions, peace movement developments, I've written reviews, and I think the one thing about Dimension is that, to my mind, it is the only magazine of its kind in the English-speaking world that really emerged out of the 60s and the New Left, and it is still there today. It hasn't changed the world, but it has been a forum for those who want to change the world. It's been a place where we can debate, argue, and put forward positions. It's always been broad and wide-ranging. On occasion, some of us have been censored, but very rarely. Very rarely. And Cy would never admit that and would deny it. And it's a rare event. And so I think the magazine really occupies a very special place on the Canadian left. It has been a forum for so many of us to actually put forward ideas and to try to develop social movements, ways and means of resisting, and to combat the capitalism that has increasingly been the more sort of voracious enemy of all of us in all of our diversity. So for me, Dimension has a very special place. I was honored and delighted to contribute to the book, and I've been very proud to be a sort of contributing author for many years. The first speaker I think we'll ask to come up is Dennis Pilon, who's worked with Dimension, has a piece in the collection, and will speak to you as he wishes.
Right. Well, yeah. I want to start with a story that Simon Black told. We were in Calgary at the Congress, and there was an event for the book's launch there. Cy was there, and Brenda Austin-Smith, and a whole bunch of other people who've been involved with Dimension for many decades. And Simon Black was there. I don't know if many of you, if all of you know Simon, but he's a prof now down at Brock. And he was talking about how he was first contacted by Cy. And basically, he'd written a piece for Rabble on sport and class, and he talked about how it came together. He got this piece together. He was really nervous about it. He didn't really feel very sure about himself. And lo and behold, he gets an email from Cy Gonick, who says, "Wow, this is a great piece. I love it. Would you consider writing a sports column for us at Canadian Dimension?" And it was a very touching story because Simon basically said, as a guy from a working class background, didn't have a lot of confidence about what kind of contribution I could make. This was just a real shot in the arm to have someone like Cy write him a letter, tell him that he really admired what he was doing, and asked him to be a part of the magazine. I thought, what a great story. But it also made me deeply suspicious, because that sounded a lot like what happened to me at Saigotic. And it made me think that Cy was a very wily operator. You know, he was always on the lookout for new people that he could bring into the collective, new blood, people who would take up the mantle of people who'd given something but now were moving on to something else. And I think that is an indication of the kind of leadership that Cy had with the magazine. It was always Cy's baby, everybody knew that. There was an editorial collective, and for the most part, Cy was happy to let the collective make the decisions. But every now and then, word would come down, Cy wanted X, and what Cy wanted, Cy would get. But he was very ecumenical in terms of his approach to the left. And he had a very old left kind of mentality, I think in the best sense, which is that it's all in. The historic left was not a niche market. It was not about keeping people out. It was bringing the maximum number of people into the project that you were doing. And so I think you see that with the constant renewal of the board, and particularly young people that he would try to bring in to participate in the magazine. When I was at UVic, I had a student who was really interested in progressive politics. This young guy from some very small town outside of Kelowna. And so, I got him working on something, and he wrote up something, and he submitted to the magazine, and the magazine published it. And he was so excited to have something in Canadian Dimension. This was, a real highlight. And I was very proud to be able to see that Dimension would play that kind of role with a young activist. The chapter that I was asked to do in this project, it surprised me. I work on voting systems, I work on elections, I work on, people say to me, why are you working on those topics? They seem kind of boring, frankly. And I say, no, there's lots of class struggle, there's lots of car chases and drive-bys. I mean, really, if you look, you can see lots of exciting stuff, if you know where to look. So I was very excited when Cy asked me to participate in this book, because I thought, oh great, he's going to ask me to do like elections and Canadian Dimension, a whole chapter, election geek, I'm going to find that exciting. But when the word came down, I was asked to do the personal dimension. Okay, well, that's not what I expected. Not the charge I was expecting from the leader. I wasn't exactly sure why I was asked to do it. Anyway, he gave me a long list of things that he thought should be included, and the project was basically, we had a whole long list of articles that we had to look at that Cy and others had thought, fit the theme, and then we had to write something up. And when you look at the book, you'll see that people were very creative in taking up this mission. But for me, I guess part of it was really satisfying to see how well Canadian Dimension looked compared to the kinds of things that I'd always read. We read in academe accounts of the left and, its folly or its difficulties or its shortcomings. And certainly, CD was not perfect. CD was pretty much behind the curve on the women's movement. And there were other, absences. But in other ways, CD was ahead of the curve. On sexuality politics, there were some very early interventions in Canadian Dimension, well before you would see them in other places. So I was very pleased to see the way in which Canadian Dimension had actually taken seriously the rise of the personal as political in a whole host of ways. And my chapter goes into some detail about what I would kind of characterize as different eras of that discussion. Whether it was looking at the way that personal politics was, or personal issues were brought into the mainstream in the 1970s in both good and bad ways, or the way in which storytelling and personal testimony became more the norm in the 90s and aughts. So it was very, it was interesting to read and see, and I think in the end, Canadian Dimension acquitted itself quite well compared to its contemporaries in terms of the way that it took seriously the personal as an important dimension of politics. So anyway, I don't want to go on any longer because there are other people who want to speak, but there's the teaser, no spoiler alerts, read the chapter. I think it's pretty good. I wrote it. And I'll turn it back to Bryan.
The next person that I might call on is David Hugill. Is he? Where's David? Who also I want to thank very much for playing the key role in organizing this event, getting us this venue, getting the books to me so I could haul them here, and because he's traveling around as he's often doing. He wrote a wonderful piece on the urban dimension, urban space, urban politics, and he will be able to talk in a very wide-ranging, if contained way.
contained, for sure. Thank you, Bryan. Thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks. This is my first. I think this was my first time at a cabaret venue like this on a stool. And and speaking of cabaret venue, I really want to thank my friend Richard Newman, whose family has run the Imperial Pub since 1950, and I want to just, or since the
Can't believe it's still here.
And I want to tell actually one amazing story about the Imperial Pub because we're here in such a great institution. Actually, this chapter that I wrote for the book, I wrote 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, 2011, 2010, as these things go. And I was in Minneapolis at the time, and at that point I had a theory that the worst bar in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is the lesser half of the Twin Cities, of which Minneapolis is one, is better than the best bar in Canada. And the only exception to that otherwise ironclad rule is this amazing old institution. And I want to tell an amazing story about the Imperial Pub because I think it just speaks to the character of the people who run this place. In like the mid '60s or something like that, my friend Richard's grandfather wanted to introduce food, or perhaps for his license had to introduce food as part of their offerings, and so they introduced, I think, brats, as in bratwurst kind of things, and they got a big shiny new sign outside that said, "We believe our brats are the best, the best brats in town." And Richard's grandfather had this sign up for a couple weeks and was just eating at him. It was like so painful for him to have this super arrogant sign claiming they had the best brats in town out front. So eventually they had to have the sign changed, taken down, and at great expense changed to the Imperial Pub. We believe we have the best brats in town, which is such a great story and actually so in keeping with the character of his grandson. Just to say a few quick words about the book itself. As Bryan pointed out briefly, referring to Cy's distaste for the title, it's actually not a people's history of Canada since 1960. It's a book of essays about this journal, this magazine that's been around for 50 years. It was such an interesting experience to go through 50 years of urban reportage, especially for, and this is sort of all I really want to say here, especially for someone who, like me, who was born in 1981 and has students, or had students at the time that I was writing anyway when I was teaching a course at Glendon College, many of whom were not even alive in the dawn of the Mike Harris era in Ontario. So, in the grand scheme of things, I've had a very short political life. And one of the things that was so interesting for me about reading this book, especially in the context of these students who were 19 and 20 and had only known the Toronto of the millennium, was actually just some amazing reportage on how repressive Toronto was. And there's just some great pieces, especially about the emergence of the Gayborhood, and actually there's a fabulous event going on at 519 tonight. Is it 519? That other event that's happening tonight, which is, I think, commemorating the bathhouse raids, which were 30 years ago. But there's amazing reportage from the front lines of those struggles, people talking about what it was like to be in Toronto at the time. And I want to quote a little bit from one of these if I can find it. And this is, of course, in contrast to the one of the narratives that people know about Toronto, right, which is of the 80s and 90s, or especially the late 70s and the 80s, this moment of nominally progressive government, Toronto the good, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's some great reportage on it's a kind of a counterpoint to that liberal story and that romantic story. So in 1981, right at the height of this sort of police menace that was visited upon members of the Church Street neighborhood over here. Someone wrote, two guys, Ken Popart and Brian Mossop, some of you probably know them, observed that and then I'm quoting here, segments of the force, meaning the Toronto police force, responded to the new Toronto, namely the Toronto that was suddenly diverse, was different, was looking like a new city to many of these people, responded to the new Toronto by embracing a paranoid, racist, sexist, and homophobic ideology in which they saw themselves as the lone battlers for civilization, namely small-town Protestant Ontario, against immigrants of all colors, lesbians and gays, Jews, and even Catholics. This perception of civilizational struggle, they write, ensured that those identified as threats would be the primary targets of aggressive policing. And they go on to chronicle some really horrifying stuff, including, for example, a staff sergeant's attempt to get gay teachers fired explicitly, the publication of a racist and viscerally homophobic internal newsletter within the police force, the death of several gay men in custody, tacit tolerance of what the writers described as a Halloween pogrom, in which thousands of suburban youths, I'm quoting here again, attacked gay people in parts of Yonge Street, and raids on bathhouses that led to mass arrests and a major fight back. And the reason I bring this stuff up is, in spite of the many problems and the many things that we should be happy and excited about in 50 years of Canadian Dimension, it's just this amazing resource and archive of things like this, these sort of political dispatches, which are both a fabulous teaching tool and just a sort of fabulous means of educating ourselves about this city that we live in and Canada in general. So I kind of want to end there, just to say that if you want to buy this book, if you'd like to own this assessment of this 50-year archive, we're selling it at the back for $25, no pressure. And maybe I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Many of you may be expecting to hear Hermione Banerjee, who wanted to be here tonight but had to send her regrets. Her daughter's been very ill and she just couldn't make it. So we're very sorry about that absence. Hermione has been a long-time contributor to Canadian Dimension, and I think we were all looking forward to hearing from her, but it just did not prove possible. To reiterate David's point, and to sort of draw the sort of draw out in some senses the strengths of this book, it has 25 chapters by various leftists across the country who are writing about the way in which a broad array of subjects have been covered and treated in Dimension since 1963. So it is not a people's history, it is a history in some senses of the magazine and its coverage, but in that coverage you will find 25 people like Dennis, like David, and like our next speaker, Elise Thorburn, who has written in Dimension and will say a few words about the meaning of the magazine for her.
Hi, thanks. I'm not in this book, but I have written stuff in Canadian Dimension before. So David asked me to just come and do a little bit of a toast to Canadian Dimension as a project and to a left publication that's remained around for 50 years. So I just wanted to start off by talking a little bit about the difficulty of maintaining a collective and collaborative print project for 50 years and what an amazing feat that is. I've been a, albeit lately, quite lax member of Upping the Ante for a long time, and we have some Upping the Ante editorial committee and collective folks here. And they also know how hard maintaining a print publication and an editorial collective and an advisory board is for 10 years, which we've been around for. Wrangling writers who can be really prickly, and everybody is a little nervous about having their stuff edited, keeping people getting their stuff in by deadline, staying relevant and on topic, staying on top of social movements, and writing in a way about social movements and about struggle that remains relevant and impactful and encourages people, brings people out to struggle. So you're kind of balancing all of those things when you're putting together a left publication, as well as combating the ways in which our language, our struggles, our projects, our movements get picked up and co-opted by neoliberalism and liberalism. So that's one of the big challenges when we're writing, is like always, being attentive to the ways in which our voices and our stories and our struggles are manipulated and can be used against us. So those are some of the difficulties of maintaining a print publication. And also it should be noted that left publications have a tendency to be fairly ephemeral, stick around for often less than 10 years and then disappear as people move on to new projects and often even leave the left, because the left hasn't really figured out a way to cope with people across the trajectory of their entire lives. So the fact that Canadian Dimension has been around for 50 years is an enormous, enormous feat. And I really hope Upping the Ante's around for 50 years too. And I think as somebody who's participated in print publications for quite some time, I also want to note the importance of print in particular, and left print publications in this moment, in this particular moment in history, and push back a little bit against the real accelerationist elements of our culture that want everything to be online and interactive right now. So radical left print publications are, as David mentioned, this amazing way to archive our stories and struggles and keep them stored in one location. But they're also, the slow pace of print really forces us to engage in sober reflection and to be sort of these relentless critics of what exists and what we're doing at all times. Not only to tell the stories of what we're doing, but to kind of think deeply and critically about how we're doing things, and to challenge ourselves to do things better and to push harder. And so that's a role I think print plays that is really, really important in this time of instantaneous think pieces to any event that takes place. Print doesn't allow us to do these instantaneous think pieces, these not very much of thinking pieces, but rather forces us to sort of deeply and soberly reflect. And the project of writing and putting together a print publication means we sit together often and communicate, debate, and collaborate about stories, and then we write those stories and articles together. So print is one of the most important ways that we can reflect on our movements and deepen the struggles we're engaged in. Also, a left publication like Canadian Dimension, much like Upping the Ante, is a way to connect our struggles across a really big country, and across some fairly disparate movements and organizing styles. And so the content in Canadian Dimension, for example, helps us share our stories and connect our movements. But participating in a publication like Canadian Dimension or Upping the Ante is also a really important way to connect movements, to connect the projects and struggles we're engaged in with other struggles across the country and internationally. David and I were talking a little bit this morning about a project we worked on a couple of years ago, 6 years ago now, I think, where we interviewed people in student movement and higher education struggles in Greece, the UK, Italy, and the Netherlands. And what an amazing project it was to connect those stories of people doing that kind of organizing work with bringing those stories to people here at a time before we had the 2012 big strike in Quebec, before student movements were really at the center of a lot of people's consciousness, at least this time around. So participating in these publications is a really important way to connect with other struggles and to bring other struggle stories to our own struggles, to our own comrades. But it's also a way to connect with other people doing organizing work and sharing radical ideas and radical thought across the country. So advisory boards and editorial collectives like Canadian Dimensions and also Upping the Antes bring together people from all across the country. It's a way to meet other people engaged in struggle and share struggle. So it's really, really important. So one thing I guess I'd like to end with is to invite people to get involved with projects like Canadian Dimension and keep them alive, and Upping the Ante, and keep it alive, keep these publications going. Canadian Dimension has been around for 50 years, and I hope that we can celebrate again in another 50 years and that all of you will have written for or joined the editorial collective of this project. So thanks very much, and get participating in radical left print publications. Thank you.
Okay, well that was great, and to put another plug in for the book, if you don't know Saigonic and you don't know that much about the history of Canadian Dimension, the book is introduced by an almost 100-page essay on Dimension, written by Sai, which is both fitting and I think will, introduce you to somebody who's in many ways committed his life. As he says in that introduction, other than his children and his family, this is probably the most important project in his life. And it's a fascinating life, and it's one that, as I said before, it's quite rare. Up until the 90s, Canada had 3 of these kinds of magazines, which was itself very rare. This magazine which started out as this magazine is about schools, Canadian Dimension, and Our Generation.
Canadian Forum does figure in there?
I don't think so. No, but that's my social democratic bias. But also, it's in some senses a different kind, and that goes back a long way. And you could actually argue that magazines like Dissent in the U.S. are part of that kind of project with their continuum. But I would say, as New Left print publications, Canada was rare in having 3 of them last into the 90s, and Dimension is really the only one. This magazine still exists, but in a very, very different format, I would say. Sorry? Briar Patch, but when was it started?
Our time, 30 years ago.
It's not 50.
Okay.
Believe me, you'll know the difference when you get to be my age. That last 20 is harder, right, Sam? The last speaker tonight is Greg Albo, who has been a long-time contributor with Canadian Dimension and involved in the magazines, part of its Toronto editorial collective, and he has a co-authored piece in the book, and he will close things off tonight.
David mentioned 1980, and that actually is the first time I met Cy. I've been working in my part of Winnipeg as an undergraduate student on a group dealing with layoffs at the CN Railways, at the Griffin Steel strike. And I'd gone to, as a supporter of the people I've been working with, I went to the NDP convention that was then going to be electing Howard Pauley. And I ran into Cy at that convention. As the first time I met him, he was, of course, hawking magazines outside, and he gave me an arm full of them. And that was my first introduction to Cy. A year later, I was in his classes at the University of Manitoba in economics and studying with him. It's through that I became associated particularly with Sam Ginden, Leo Panich, Harold Chorney, I guess Sim Gill as well, associated with Cy. People often thought then I was from the north end of Winnipeg. I was not. I was from Transcona, another part of Winnipeg. And then people would often associate me also as being Jewish because I was associated with this group, but I was not of Jewish background either. But that is kind of a long, long time history with Cy, and part of that training in economics that all of us got, and it associated also with Canadian Dimension, and all of us had started writing for Canadian Dimension at one point in time. Pretty much all of us, maybe not Sim. Is Sim? No, I don't think Sim, but everybody else in that group has written for Canadian Dimension at different points in time. I was asked to take on a big challenge, and I did it with Chris Bailey, who's here tonight, of analyzing or taking on and trying to summarize the long history of writing on the political economy of Canada across the pages of Canadian Dimension, which is an enormous undertaking. As a result, I can also now claim I've read all 50 years of that archive, which is a lot considering most of the time, this is part of the record that was just being spoken of a print publication, of it being erratic at times and not necessarily always being the most precise on its issue numbers and things like this, but it was an amazing experience. I think in doing that with Chris, there was a couple of things that stood out in this. One of them is it's just a remarkable history of almost every critical political economist that has been in Canada has written for it at one point in time, going back to the 1960s. Pentland, Heimer, Cy himself,
Watkins,
Locksley, McQuaig, Cohen, Panich, Ginden, Berger, Clausen, and so on and so on. Just everybody at some point in time has contributed a piece to the magazine. The other thing is when one reading it over this amount of time, it's every kind of major national and often regional issue was covered as part of developing a critical understanding of the events of the day. In the 1960s, a lot of the debate about inflation, foreign direct investment. In the 1970s, all the issues related to wage and price controls, inflation, the food inflation, resources, and so on and so on through the decades. So you kind of have this running interpretation from the left about critical developments in Canada. The other thing I think that surprised me when I went back, although I'd known it a bit of this from being around the CD circles in Manitoba and some of the debates there, is that there was actually a consistent writing related to First Nations and ecology, largely linked to the extractive sector. But actually there's a range of writings on this that I was a bit surprised when reading through it. They went all the way back to the 1960s on those issues. Which is particularly around the extractive sector and linking it to First Nations struggles was a consistent theme. One of the major themes, of course, that Canadian Dimension has been known for over all this time period, which is the theme that Chris and I largely pulled out to kind of give relative emphasis to, is the debate about economic nationalism and foreign direct investment. This has been a key theme in the writing about Canada forever, given the colonial settler status of Canada. Before the 1960s, before CD was formed, this writing was dominated particularly by the writing of Harold Innis, Easterbrook and Aitken, and all the rest of the Staples thesis, which particularly then located Canada basically in the set of exchange relations for the world market, and Canada's place being linked to raw material exports. But it also, the critical positions on this weren't very deep either. In the Communist Party's writing on this, in its Canada's Path to Socialism, which was, if I remember right, is Canadian Independence and Canada's Path to Socialism, and was also in Tim Buck's most well-known book that circulated in Canada, Lenin in Canada, was the theme particularly that was consistent with the Staples thesis in the struggle over national independence, consistent with the strategic themes of the communist parties around the world, of the national road to socialisms. Similarly, the social democratic themes, which you could find in social planning for Canada in the 1930s, or books like David Lewis's Make This Your Canada, were also consistent with that kind of writing. The break that occurred in the 1960s was a break about those themes. And of course, in Canada, it was linked to dependency theory. And it was very much, dependency theory very much was itself associated with various theorizations of capitalist exchange relations, which were consistent with the Staples theory. That became integrated into the debates of Canadian Dimension immediately. It was there in the first issues with contributions from Pilon. At that point in time, Charles Taylor was writing on these issues. Charles Taylor was a political economist quite often.
And a leftist.
And a leftist in the 1960s. K.J. Charles, Sy, a range of people taking on the question of foreign direct investment. After the 1960s, this was also a debate that obviously CD was the place in Canada where the Waffle Manifesto was debated. And the Waffle Manifesto represented that radical turn with independency theory of linking the critique of capitalism, capitalist exchange relations with the necessity of socialism. And the interpretation of that thesis in terms of Canada and the different positions that occurred were in the pages of Canadian Dimension, from Laxer, from Watkins, from Stephen Clarkson, from Kerry Levitt. A whole host of those writers wrote in Canadian Dimension and debated that throughout the 1970s. The other thing I think that was important for this, particularly for current debate, is that the 1970s issue related to foreign direct investment was also linked to resource control. A very important report had come out in the late 1960s in Canada, or was it, no, the early 1970s, called the Kearns Report, which dealt with resource control of the extractive sector, and particularly was linked to the problems that we still have around royalty regimes and the profits and that the big companies take, and the problems this causes for Canadian governments, Canadian people, and particularly also First Nations. And that was a central part of that debate. The first critical analysis of the tar sands in Canada were really centered in Canadian dimension before the books from Larry Pratt on the tar sands, Ed Schaefer on oil and class had come out in the 1970s. Those debates had been in the pages of Dimension. In the 1980s, some of this debate started shifting in the 90s in around the anti-globalization debate, but it was a sustained part of the debate on the Canadian left and in the pages of Canadian Dimension. Although Dimension was always associated particularly with the left nationalist position, I think this is unfair when one looks at the range of assessments that were in the magazine over the years. It's very much as Bryan had indicated earlier, there was a habit of Psi to kind of generate or put different positions in it and then kind of maybe shape the balance. The minoritarian position was the one that associated economic nationalism in a strong sense with particularly gaining control over Canadian corporations, and by definition that would be an improvement in Canadian society. That was the minoritarian position associated with Laxer at different points in time, Stephen Clarkson. But from the beginning, that was not the position, for example, that Gonnet took on, was not the position at that point in time of Larry Pratt, was not the position of Ed Schaefer, was not the position of a whole range of people. It was majoritarian position, no doubt, was size, which is the view that these were all impossible. These orientations were impossible without it being linked to socialism and democratic control. And was what has been, I think, a consistent theme from that majoritarian position, if Psi represents it, is a lineage to that theme within the Waffle Manifesto. Not a range of its other themes, but particularly that theme. There was also another minoritarian position linked with link to the internationalization of capital in Canada as a secondary imperialist power, which was Psi had encouraged the dissent from that debate in Dimension that had come from various sections of the Trotskyist movement. Then a range of other writers, Jerome Clausen, Fletcher Berger, Sam, myself, Leo, a whole bunch of other people were also associated with that position. So I think there are a number of final things I would just want to say about Dimension and these themes. I think there are about 4 or 5 themes around political economy that have been extremely important in Dimension. One is the impossibility of there being democratic control, democracy in Canada without it being linked to socialization. And that socialization question and democracy in the pages of Dimension has been consistently linked to the struggle of the Quebecois, First Nations people, and the rest of Canada. It was a consistent theme across most of the writing. The second theme, I think, is particularly there from the beginning, but particularly in the late 1990s, there was a turn to an emphasis on ecology. In fact, in many ways, the source of the initial sources of writing on eco-socialism in Canada were in the pages of Canadian Dimension that were consistently there from the 1990s on. The other theme, I think, is what's often been uncomfortable in the broad Canadian left, is the theme about liberal democracy, and particularly the way that the liberal democracy under neoliberalism has taken an authoritarian turn and has incorporated social democracy within its parameters. This has been a theme of Canadian Dimension that actually Psi initially stated in an essay, when the crisis was still unfolding in the early 1980s, had said was a possibility of the way neoliberalism might unfold. And then it became a consistent theme in Dimension from the late 1990s on. And I think that was the place where this theme, and it's meant for some uncomfortable relations, particularly with the New Democratic Party in Canada and where the left finds itself. I think that has been one of the strengths of Canadian Dimension over the years. It's been there to make people uncomfortable with the range of positions. It's partly through the positions that Psy has taken on different issues and has pushed through the magazines, but it's also been poking at what has been the difficulty of the Canadian left, is finding our route to an alternative politics, an alternative political organization, an alternative vision of socialism, and our place in the world as building that socialism. I think the banner of Canadian Dimension has been always for people who want to change the world. That was the banner. I think it came in play in the 1990s. And I think it's also, the question is how do we begin and how do we build that process and project in Canada? Thank you. I want to finish and just say, because Cy will see this. Hi, Cy. Nice, congratulations. The book finally came out, and peace and 50 more years. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming, for being supporters, readers, writers, contributors to Dimension. I want to thank again the Imperial Pub, which David mentioned. It's very nice to have this room for this event. I want to thank David in particular for doing the lion's share of the work of organizing this. I also want to thank in the back another young Dimension writer, Sean Carlton, who's back there in the Blue Jays cap selling books. The great socialist agitator, William Morris, used to talk to audiences much smaller than this in the United Kingdom in the 1880s. And he used to say, "I'm here not to let you be contented with too little." And in a way, that's what Gonick has done, that's what Dimension has done, and that's what this book is really about. For all of these projects that Cy has been involved in over the years, of which Dimension is probably the most significant, and Cy himself, have been struggling not to let us on the left be contented with too little, not to let us collapse our understandings of the socialist project into very narrow containers. The book, I think, is a reflection of Dimension's capacity to speak widely and broadly about the kind of social transformation that Greg just spoke about. And it's really, I think, fitting that this large and important book provide a record of that at this point. And in some senses, it's Cy's legacy, and I would say hello to Cy as well, and say, we wish him the best for his next 50 years in Canadian Dimension.